Good morning, everyone. Andrew Douglas of the Action News 5 digital desk. For decades, NASA and NOAA have been keeping careful watch of the Earth's climate, and each year, the agencies release an update to the hottest years on record. Yesterday, they added 2022 to the books. Let's talk about that. We have Dennis Felixson, a NASA research scientist, joining us here on the Action News 5 digital desk to talk about the global temperature data for 2022. Dennis, good morning. Tell us about the latest data.
Having me. Well, with 2022 having come to a close, we can now say that last year was the 5th warmest year on record, tied with 2015. These records go back to the late 1800s. So over that time, 2022 was the 5th warmest. And actually, the last 9 years were the warmest years on that record. Last year was particularly interesting because it was a La Nina year. La Nina is the counterpart to El Nino, and during La Nina years, we tend to have a temporary cooling of the Earth. So even during that temporary cooling, 2022 still came in as one of the warmest years we've ever measured.
You know, it's interesting, Dennis. We had something this week that measured, I guess, the ozone in the atmosphere across the world, and it said that the ozone layer is actually growing. I don't know if that's part of this, but I know that that is something that people have been carefully watching.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you probably know, ozone, the hole in the ozone was a huge story back in the 90s when I was growing up. That's actually part of the reason I got interested in being a NASA Earth scientist. So the interesting thing about this is that climate change has all sorts of impacts, ozone being one of them, and it's also a driver. There are all these feedbacks in the climate system, but it's all interconnected, and that's one of the coolest parts about working at NASA and with satellite data is we get to study the Earth as kind of a whole system and look at different impacts that climate is having, like relationship to the ozone, what the oceans are doing, the surface temperature of the Earth, and the impacts that climate change is having on extreme events that we're measuring all around the world.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned the 5th hottest on record last year, but the story about the ozone layer was that the ozone layer was actually growing. It was actually a good thing, and the hole wasn't as big as it was years ago. How does that counterbalance or balance with the climate data from 2022?
That's right. So that's a good point. If I remember right, we had, the ozone hole was a big story back in the 90s, and then CFCs were banned partially as the result of us discovering this hole in the ozone layer. And that actually had a very positive and kind of fast impact in terms of climate, where the ozone hole saw the ozone hole start to shrink. So it was a direct impact of some policy to ban CFCs. Now, those kind of things are great, and it's nice to see that. But the trend of global warming is continuing, and year after year, on average, when we look over 10-year spans, the Earth is continuing to warm. And so while those kind of things like banning CFCs and the effect it had on the ozone hole are great to see, it's not enough to reverse this overall year after year trend of warming that we're seeing.
I'm sure a lot of these satellites that NASA and NOAA release into space help understand climate, ozone, keeping track of everything. How do those new satellites help really kind of understand the science behind it all?
So from space, we have this really unique vantage point where we have many satellites that are collecting different measurements of different parts of the Earth system all at once. And collectively, we get a much better understanding of the Earth system acting as one whole system with these different components acting in tandem. So last year, 2 of the satellites that we launched, GOES and JPSS, these are launched by NASA and operated by NOAA. These are just the latest in a series of satellites that help us continue to monitor the weather and understand the impact that climate is having on weather and on extreme events. There's another satellite we launched called SWOT, S-W-O-T, Surface, Water, and Ocean Topography, really cool satellite that's going to give us look at all of the water that's sitting on the surface of the Earth. So these are oceans, lakes, rivers. Every 21 days, we're going to get a complete snapshot of what's happening. So it's really amazing what we can do from this unique vantage point of space that we can't get from other kinds of measurements on the ground.
So Dennis, a question for you, because I hear this a lot from some of the critics of this and global warming, climate change, is that, okay, if we do some of the things, for example, from the Paris Climate Accord, and we implement some of those standards, that, okay, 30, 40, maybe 50 years from now, our temperature will be reduced by 1/10 of 1% 50 years from now. And so, the idea is that we give up all this stuff for just a small fraction of a fraction difference. What do you say to that?
So that's a great question. And these numbers might seem small, but their impact is huge. So even though, for example, since the late 1800s, the surface temperature of the Earth has warmed as the result of human emissions by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit on average. 2 degrees Fahrenheit might seem really small, right? Does it matter if it's 70 degrees outside or 72? That's not going to affect what you put on that morning to go out, right? But the impacts it has are huge, even those small numbers. We're already seeing big increases in extreme events. Hurricanes that are making landfall are able to intensify a lot more quickly because of ocean warming. They're also able to carry a lot more precipitation, and that causes real damage to people and to infrastructure that we have on the coasts. We know that the wildfire seasons are getting longer. That's leaving more and more areas exposed to fire damage. Droughts are getting more intense. Heat waves, the atmospheric rivers that we saw hit California last week were intense as they were because the climate is warming. So every little bit that we can do to mitigate it 30, 40 years from now, even tenths of a degree will matter in terms of the impact of these extreme events.
And again, playing the other side here, Dennis, while we have you here, okay, so the world has been around for billions of years, and it's constantly warming and cooling and warming and cooling. We only have data from, as you mentioned, the late 1800s. So how are we supposed to say that things weren't hotter in medieval times? You know what I mean?
Yeah, another great question. So the temperature data, the most reliable temperature data, direct measurements of temperature goes back to the 1800s. But we actually have other records that go back much longer than that. For example, ice cores that we've dug up from deep in the interior of Antarctica and Greenland give us a way to estimate the temperature going back hundreds of thousands of years. And that kind of information lets us know that, number one, the Earth has definitely not been this hot in at least 10,000 years and possibly 100,000 years. And again, from that longer term data, we know that the rate at which the Earth is warming now is unprecedented. We've never seen this in ice core records that go back those hundreds of thousands of years. So not only is the Earth hotter now than it has been in 10,000 years, but it's also warming much more quickly than that 100,000-year ice core record that we know of.
You know, it's a really interesting conversation, Dennis. I appreciate it very much. Where can people go online for more information?
So you can find us on the web at nasa.gov/Earth. You can go to noaa.gov, NOAA.gov. And for you social media lovers out there, you can follow us at NASA Earth on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, and at NOAA to follow NOAA.
Okay, Dennis Felixson, NASA science and NASA research scientist. We appreciate you, and I appreciate this conversation very much.
Thanks very much for having me. I appreciate it.